Hey guys, I thought that since it's a winter wonderland outside suddenly, that I would record our discussion of Patrick Hopkins' gender treachery in front of my fake fire with my real pajamas. When we talked about Carol Cohn's piece, Wars, Wimps, and Women, it was to set up a discussion of the idea of gender as applying to more than just bodies or people. Cohn is interested in talking about gender discourse and the way that institutions can get gendered, disciplines can get gendered, countries can get gendered. You guys have been having a great discussion about that on the discussion forum. And today, what we're going to look at is how Patrick Hopkins takes the idea of masculinity in particular and uses it to explain homophobia as a phenomenon. Patrick Hopkins begins his article, Gender Treachery, Homophobia, Masculinity, and Threatened Identities, with a story from his experience at a Christian high school. And the story is just about how the insult of choice in that high school, because fag or queer were considered dirty words, was girl. The reason why girl could be used as an insult, Hopkins says, is that it signifies a failure of living up to a gendered standard of behavior and a gendered standard of identity. Hopkins is going to go on in the rest of the article to talk about how our culturally constructed sense of gender is really tightly tied up with who we see ourselves as being. And he's going to use that to explain the phenomenon of homophobia, the incredibly violent and hateful acts that people perpetuate just because they see someone else as being attracted to members of their own sex. It doesn't make sense given any of the three contemporary analyses that we have for homophobia. So he's going to walk through them, and then at the end of the article, what he does is explains why he thinks the kind of violence and extreme reactions we find in homophobia actually stem from a sense of gender as being essential to the self, so that someone else's acting out or betrayal of gender in a way that's non-standard can feel like an attack on who you are as a person, because it destabilizes your sense of who you are. As Hopkins says on page 113, categories of gender produce a multiplicity of other categories in a society. We talked about that last week when we were discussing Carol Cohn's Wars, Wimps, and Women. If, for example, being a woman is associated with being nurturing and emotional and caring and compassionate and associated with bodily things, then it's going to be really common for women in a society that associates those things with being female to assign child-rearing tasks to that group. On the other hand, if you associate masculinity with rationality and stoicism and independence and willpower, it's going to be much more common to assign tasks that we think require those qualities to people gendered as masculine. Individuals' sense of personhood, what he calls their sense of self, is largely the result of their construction as members of particular social groups within society at large. For a man to qualify as a man, he must possess a certain, or worse, uncertain, number of demonstrable characteristics that make it clear that he is not a woman. And a woman must possess characteristics demonstrating that she is not a man. Physical and material competition with other men, independence, behavioral autonomy, rationality, strict emotional control, aggressiveness, obsession with status and success, right? There's a certain way of walking, a certain way of talking. All you have to do to get a good illustration of this is watch any movie ever made where somebody's trying to masquerade as someone from the opposite sex. So if you've ever seen, oh crap, what's the movie where she has to pretend that she's a dude? Anyway, there's always a scene when women are masquerading as men where someone teaches them how to walk like a man, and vice versa. If you've seen Miss Congeniality, one of the most amazing scenes at the beginning of that is where Michael Caine is trying to teach Sandra Bullock how to walk like a woman. The big problem that she's having at the beginning of that film is that she's gendered so heavily masculine that she can't be taken seriously as a woman, and she's supposed to be going undercover in the Miss United States pageant and can't do that because she doesn't possess the kind of characteristics that we associate with femininity. If you think about that movie, though, it's actually really telling that at the beginning of Miss Congeniality, what Sandra Bullock's character has are all the markings of male professional success. She works for the frickin' FBI, right? She's a really good code breaker. And her main flaw, it turns out in the opening scene, is that she's too emotional, right? She tries to help this Russian dude when he's choking, and that's what makes the mission go south. Having the characteristics of masculinity are having the characteristics that we associate with success in contemporary American culture. That makes the betrayal or forfeiture of those characteristics seem unsettling. It's going to make sense for women to try to want to pick up characteristics associated with men. Who's not going to want to sound more authoritative? Who's not going to want to seem more rational in business discussions? Hopkins is saying that part of the penalty that you get if you're betraying masculinity is that you're betraying the position of privilege and power. Because personal identity is so heavily gendered, says Hopkins, any threat to sex-gender categories is derivatively interpreted as a threat to personal identity. Being gay is one of the ways of subverting that category because you're betraying the fundamental rule of seeing women as sexual objects. As soon as you turn your gaze towards other men and you portray them as sexual objects, right? Objects of attraction, objects of desire, other men react to that strongly negatively, in part because it shakes their sense of identity about who they are and what role they have to play in the world. One of the reasons why masculinity is so easy to shake is because it's simultaneously portrayed as something that men just naturally are or have because, they have secondary sex characteristics associated with men. I mean, it's not like we're looking at your junk when we attribute you a male rather than a female identity, usually. Instead, what we're looking at are the way that they're performing masculinity. And the worry is you're supposed to essentially be masculine, and yet you can fail to perform masculinity well enough. That's the force of calling somebody a girl when they fumble a pass or do something stupid, right? You call them a girl because it shows that you don't think that they've performed up to the masculine ideal. And that's an insult because, as we've talked about before, this category of woman or girl is other. It's not the category associated with self or subject. It's the category associated with being an object, with being inessential. So the primary explanation that Hopkins gives for homophobia in this article is that gay men are threatening other men's sense of masculinity and therefore sense of personal identity simply by being attracted to members of their own sex. Hopkins also takes the time to distinguish between homophobia and heterosexism. Heterosexism, he says, characterizes a political situation in which heterosexuality is presented and perceived as natural, moral, practical, and superior to any non-heterosexual option. As a result, that's heterosexism. It means that when you meet someone, you assume that they're straight until you find out otherwise. It means that you don't have usually discussions with your children where you say things like, "Are you sure that you're straight? I mean, have you tried to be gay?" The norm, the given, the natural is seen as being heterosexual. Hopkins sees heterosexism as the precondition or ground for homophobia. He says it's not the same thing. Homophobia is a kind of hatred, right? He says heterosexism isn't enough to describe or account for the scene of 10 Texas teenage boys beating a gay man with nail-studded boards and stabbing him to death. Homophobia is a political word, not a psychiatric one. It doesn't mean that you're scared of same-sex attracted people. It means that you loathe them, right? That you hate them. And in a lot of cases, that you're willing to do violence to them, either physically or mentally, emotionally, by how you talk, the things you say, the way that you interact with your fellow human beings. The bulk of Hopkins' article is walking through 3 common hypotheses given that are meant to explain homophobia as a social and political phenomenon, and then to show why none of them by themselves are going to be enough to account for the kind of deep personal outrage that causes people to act so hatefully to other human beings. The first hypothesis that he considers is the Repression Hypothesis. The Repression Hypothesis is the idea that homophobes are people who are actually repressing their own desires for members of their own sex. One of the lines here is, he's not trying to convince us, he's trying to convince himself. And there are any number of famous TV evangelical pastors or conservative senators or political figures that have turned out to be secretly gay to support this hypothesis to some degree. But Hopkins wants to say that's not enough. There are way more homophobic people out there in the world than there are repressed homosexuals. It's not just so simple as self-loathing or fear of desires that you don't want to have. That can explain some homophobia, but it's certainly not going to explain most of it. And so Hopkins goes on to describe another hypothesis, which he calls the Irrationality or Ignorance Hypothesis. This is what I like to think of as the Pbf Hypothesis. The idea that, or the NPR hypothesis, the idea that it's because people don't know better. If only we could just educate them, then they'd see that they don't need to be scared of these other people. They don't need to be hateful of these other people. It's just a lack of knowledge or personal acquaintance. Again, Hopkins says, that's not going to explain the vast majority of homophobia. It's not irrational to be homophobic if you live in a society that rewards it. When a teenage boy calls another boy a fag or a queer to insult them, it's not because he doesn't know that that's an insult. He knows exactly why it's an insult and why it's going to be so devastating. As Hopkins says, it's not the case that homophobia is somehow obviously dysfunctional on an individual or group level. Instead, homophobic activity carries with it certain rewards and a certain power to influence. If you think about how we were describing Foucault's conception of power as a dynamic network of non-centralized forces, this starts to make more sense. The main reason why you're going to be willing to self-surveil and self-correct to fit certain social norms is for the perceived benefit. And so if your status in a group is threatened, or if your status in a group is uncertain, one way to gain status within that group is to use the insults and to show the kind of prejudices that the other people in that group have. This is also going to be true in homophobic societies. And so homophobic behavior, long story short, isn't going to be irrational in social groups and social situations that are going to actively reward those kinds of attitudes. And it's not just going to be a matter of ignorance either. It requires a certain kind of social savvy, a certain kind of knowledge of social identities to be able to do this in the first place. Homophobic behavior can win approval from peers and authority figures, protects one from becoming the target of other homophobes, and reaffirms one's place in a larger context of gender-appropriate behavior, protecting one's personal identity. The third hypothesis that Hopkins offers is the political response hypothesis. The political hypothesis gains traction from groups like James Dobson's Focus on the Family and Oral Roberts and, dang, I can't remember their names anymore. I'm really bad at remembering the names of the haters. It's weird, right? They're good. Anyway, the political hypothesis sees homosexuality and the LGBT plus movement as a political threat that needs to be addressed by legislation and that needs to be stamped out on the sort of local civic level. Hopkins acknowledges that there are these groups. However, Hopkins says the vast majority of people who engage in homophobic attacks, whether it's name-calling, whether it's beating the crap out of, if you've watched the Netflix special The Net, there's an incredibly powerful story that comes in at the end of that. And it's impossible to think about that kind of deeply violent assault as the sort of rational response to a political threat. Hopkins gives a quote from somebody who participated in that kind of attack, and when asked why, said that he never really thought of queers as real people. The political hypothesis might account for some homophobia. It's definitely part of how homophobia gets entrenched in systems and institutions by laws and by rules, standards of conduct and things like that. But Hopkins says it can't explain why human beings are willing to beat the living crap out of a fellow human being. That's not a rational political response. What Hopkins wants to say then, at the end of the day, is that a man acts on an erotic orientation towards other men, he violates a tenet of masculinity. he fails at masculinity. And most importantly, appears to reject standards by which real men are defined as selves, as subjects. So what should our response be? If homophobia arises from a perceived sense of self in which gender and the characteristics associated with being a particular gender are somehow central, Hopkins says that we should try to deconstruct that gender binary. And that's where gender treachery comes in. At the end of the article, he says he wants to betray gender. And what he means by that is he wants to combine characteristics from these two lists that are supposed to be mutually exclusive. And that option is only going to work in a world where enough other people choose it as well. As Hopkins says, the only way to ensure that heterosexism and its virulent manifestation homophobia are genuinely eliminated is to eliminate the binary itself. Challenge the assumption that one must be sexed or gendered to be a person. In summary, Hopkins examines 3 commonly offered hypotheses as an explanation for homophobia and homophobic behavior, and argues that none of them are by themselves or even taken together enough to explain homophobia as a phenomenon. Instead, he offers an explanation for homophobia that grounds it in the way that gender is seen as an essential, central part of personal identity, of our sense of who we are. And he says the only way we're going to be able to root out homophobia is by betraying gender, by refusing to see the world in terms of mutually exclusive binary opposition between masculine and feminine. In the weeks to come, we're going to be looking at a number of people who offer different ways of doing that. And we'll be having discussions about the effectiveness or the pros and cons of adopting various different approaches. Until next week, I hope you guys are doing well. Goodbye.